good evening, everybody, whatever you're from, depending on your time zone. Pick the one you like. So thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it. My name is Robin Ayoub with the Localization Fireside Chat, and welcome to episode 190. Today we are recording a great episode. Today, 190 episode. I can't believe I'm saying that on the Localization Fireside Chat. Not even 2 years old now, 2.5 years old. I am thrilled to be joined by Adam Bittlingmayer, and Adam is the CEO and co-founder of ModelFront. ModelFront, a company that is pioneering AI-driven quality prediction for translation workflow. Adam brings fascinating perspective. I know I've talked to Adam before, and I'm so impressed with our first conversation. I thought, why don't we make an episode and podcast over this? Our conversation, he's not just another entrepreneur jumping on the AI bandwagon. At least that's my first impression of our conversation. He previously worked as a software engineer for Google Translate, founded Machine Translation or Machine Translate Foundation to democratize access to MT and MT resources in general. He speaks 8 languages. That's so impressive, Adam, himself. And he is also understand translations from multiple angles, the engineering side, the research side, and the actual language learner and user side. So welcome to the conversation, Adam.
Thank you, Robin. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being with me.
Shukran كتير, I could say.
Shukran. Oh, wow.
Yeah, صاحبي.
You could throw a few words in Arabic. So I'd love that.
Sure. Yeah. It's not counted in one of the 8, but yeah.
And we have something in common. I think the listeners, probably would appreciate that. I know the first conversation mentioned to me that my wife is Armenian and your wife is Armenian. Am I correct by saying that?
That's true. Yeah.
So there you go. We may meet in Armenia at some point by luck, I think. Thanks so much for joining me again. As we say on this channel, Adam, for the audience, everybody's got a story. So why don't we start with this? What is your story? What got you here?
Well, I guess kind of like you, I grew up, sort of in a little bit of chaos, and I always had a love for languages. But I also had a love for technology, and so I studied in Seattle, studied computer science, and it was very clear, right? We're talking like 2007 is when I graduated. You remember those days? I wanted to go work at Google Translate. That was just the thing. And so I got into Google and I did that, right? If you think about sort of what AI or NLP was back then, that was very much the thing to do. It was actually a very small team back then. I was one of 3 engineers. There was maybe a dozen researchers or so. Yeah. Before that, and that's kind of how I picked up some Arabic. I had been working on the transliteration API at Google. So if turning Arabizi, what they call tarib, so turning Arabizi into proper Arabic, right? So this is also very much in that range, in that domain. Android as well. Yeah, and so we're working at that point. You had about 1 billion internet users, right? So it was sort of the first billion internet users were mainly the 1 billion people who can speak English, and everything we've been doing since then has been adding the other now 7 billion who don't understand English. I was privileged to be one of the few folks sort of maintaining the Google Chrome, Google Translate integration at that time, right? Which with the launch of Android sort of became the way that a ton of people on our planet access information. Most of the websites are not in their language, right? Yeah, and so that was sort of the background. And very quickly, I sort of came to the conclusion that machine translation is great when it works, but it doesn't always work. And so what you really want is to be able to sort of, as a user, to know, okay, right now, like it was fine for all of this stuff, but on this one, it like totally hallucinated. Yeah. So, basically automatically catch when Google Translate is wrong, if you want to put it like that. So that was sort of the state of things, my career before I founded ModelFront. That was kind of what I'd done up to that
point. So how long you worked for Google then? Was that a long stint? Or?
It was 6 years.
6 years? And yeah. What was the deliverables for you, like from where you started to where you finished? Did you build a Google Translate, or did you contribute to building it?
I always felt like I was one of the later folks, because if you remember, that wave started right when I was maybe still in high school, right? Essentially. So I got to work with the tail end of the people who sort of created machine translation, online machine translation as we know it, right? So who created Google Translate? Franz Josef Och, Jakob Uskreit, who then went on to co-author the Transformer paper, Attention is All You Need. Right? But I was the youngest one one there. Yeah, it was we were spread very thin, right? If just 3 engineers. So yeah, I would say one of the contributions was stuff around like the did you mean feature. So if you type right in Arabizi or Russian in the Latin alphabet, like just make it work, right? A lot of that kind of real world stuff, that was sort of my quality focus. I did a lot of stuff like, okay, we're launching a new version. Can you break this?
Yep.
Which is totally outside of my job description as an engineer, but it sort of made it my business. And I was the one on the team who knew the most languages, right? So we were doing a lot of new language launches back then, and you're launching, let's say, Kazakh, and nobody knows Kazakh there, but hey, if you know a little bit of Turkish and you know Cyrillic, you can maybe break the thing and or at least understand what's going wrong here if somebody reports it, et cetera, et cetera. So those are the kind of things that I was doing. Yeah. And
But it's
can
interesting, though. You bring
go
a
ahead.
very valid point to the conversation when you said 1 billion people speaks English, but there are 7 other billion people don't speak English, and most of the tools are. I don't know if most, but is an accurate word, but I would say it is because at least the most visible tools are created in English, and then we try to transform them to adapt to other. How do what's your comments on that, and where are we now in that progress?
So I would say it's tools, but also content, right? So if I just say, I mean, the stuff that I've been reading lately, for example, and I read in the kind of eclectic mix of English, German, and then maybe Russian, and it kind of trails off after that. But right, you just take, maybe some article that's doing the rounds in the SF startup world right now. Those are totally not accessible to people who don't understand English. Right? So from that sense, it's not really that different than like 1999. And the really interesting articles, um, right? If you take some of the stuff around startups, around AI that's going out right now, AI actually does a pretty bad job at translating those still because it's just like such niche and novel content, right? And I think the best proof of this would be you would never tell a kid, certainly I don't tell my kids, that, hey, you don't have to learn English because like, AI is going to solve it. Like, nobody tells their kids that. So we all kind of, and even in 20 years when you're, big, right? That's not really gonna, even though we see this amazing progress. So from that perspective, it has gotten a lot better in the sense of, and that was one of the things I worked on and I was privileged to be a small part of, right? Early on, we have made a lot of progress in sort of making crappy translation really accessible to a lot of people, and it really helped a lot of people on earth, and I make no apologies for that, by the way, to all the people who are sort of bitter about it, right, who've kind of like lost sight of the goal of translation is removing language barriers, right?
That's
um
right.
so yeah, that we've made a ton of progress on. Like at least it's kind of like you can get the topic, you can get the key things, et cetera, et cetera. But in terms of like high value translation of high value content,
Probably wasn't meant for that, right?
yeah, yeah. I mean, we would never say like rely on this for medical advice or
Yeah.
something like that, right? But in terms of that, I mean, we haven't made a lot of progress in the sense that also the amount of content is exploding
Of course.
much
Yeah.
faster than the throughput and productivity of the professional human translation industry is exploding. So in that sense, it's worse than ever. There's way more content that's untranslated, and people around the world don't have that much more access to
There's not
the
much
kind of,
capacity out there, right? I mean,
yeah,
universities are not graduating that number of people that you
right, right,
require
right,
to do the translation by professional translators. So
right,
the
right,
delta needs to come from somewhere.
right. And the reason for that, which is essentially what pushed me to found ModelFront, was the following: that post editing, the translators were right. Post editing is actually not that much faster than human translation from scratch, it turns out. Because if you have to check every single word,
You may as well do the entire translation yourself.
yeah, if you're a pro, right? I mean, okay, it's maybe 20% faster or whatever, but it's not like this 10x order of magnitude that's going to like impact things at planetary scale.
Do you think we've moved the bottleneck to the post editing steps?
That's essentially where the bottleneck is, right? And so that was where we decided to found ModelFront. We said, okay, like we talked to these large translation buyers. They said, look, if you could say, we see that a ton of the translations that we send to the agencies are coming back unedited because they were actually perfectly fine. We just don't know which translations they are. So if you could, and identify those and auto confirm those, that would help us do a lot more translation.
So, is this one of the reasons that push you out? Is this one of the business reasons that you saw? Okay, there's an opportunity here. I've got to go out and build a solution on, and that's you how you come out and designed and put together ModelFront.
I would say, if I'm very honest, no, I really deeply felt that we just have to say when Google Translate is wrong, or when, we have to be able to catch this stuff. It's insane. It's 2020. That was these transformer-based models that already come out, right? The civilian world didn't hear about ChatGPT yet because they didn't care until 3.5, right? Like all this was already happening. I was like, all right, Google's not going to do this. Somebody's got to do it. Looks like it has to be me, right? But I didn't know what a TMS or an LSP was at that time. And we kind of found each other, and we found these translation teams, and then we got things rolling. But if I'm very
That's true
honest,
because you came at it from a tech perspective. You did not know the language industry at all, right?
right, right, right. So if I'm very honest, that's how it was. But then what made the business get off the ground was, we said, okay, what's the most valuable application of this? And we talked to, everybody. We talked to LSPs. We talked to, people, researchers who are doing, researchers inside Facebook or Meta or whatever, or Google, right? These are the easiest people for me to talk to because that's, my peers, about like filtering training data or evaluating models or all the possible things. But really, the highest value thing you can do is to help large translation buyers translate a lot more content at human quality.
And the post editing is the bottleneck, and you're right. It's confusing to a lot of people when it comes to post editing. And I think you and I've talked about this before. Is that entire trust era that we're in, trust period that we're going in right now as a humanity, trusting the new technology, meaning that if you are a unilingual person and you are translating something and you look at an output, you need to look at it with a certainty that this output is correct, is accurate. And you need some sort of a signal or some sort of a flag or some sort of a tool that allows you to do that. Otherwise, you're hoping it's correct. We don't know. I mean, take an example of somebody that doesn't speak Korean, and then you are going to looking at a data or a piece of content that it is in Korean. There's no way for anybody to judge that unless you speak Korean, unless you're
Right, right.
familiar with the language.
Right. And even if you do, right, at the volumes we're talking about, it's just not physically possible to necessarily review every single word, right? So, yeah, I think that's sort of one of the defining things though of translation is that, right, if I'm a large translation buyer, I have a piece of content, I want to put it into, 50 languages. There's no single translation person, director, whatever, who speaks 50 languages. So yeah, part of the problem is fundamentally that I have to send things to this agency and they come back and I don't really know.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit about ModelFront. How a talk to us a little bit about the company itself. How is business? How you're seeing things right now from ModelFront perspective?
So I would say, yeah, firstly, business is good. When I look around, both in Silicon Valley and then also in the translation industry, I'm very thankful for how business is going. I would say everything in general, I'm always impatient. So I think things have been too slow. Like if you think about what we do, right? Okay, all sounds very good. You make, decide which machine translations can skip humans, right? It's kind of the thing that everybody wants. There's just one problem with that. Half the translation industry is not even post editing yet, right? You're
You're
never
right.
going to hear that at World because that's not
No,
a very cool thing to go say on stage. But like that's the
no.
reality. And I'm talking Silicon Valley companies too. They're just starting post editing, right? Big names. Progress is just so slow because everybody's been dragging their heels. Nobody knows what the hell they're
Resistance to
doing, et
change, is
cetera,
it,
et cetera.
Adam? What do you think?
I haven't been on the operational side. I'm sure people have their reasons. We're all, I'm super resistant to change in some other areas of my life, right? I don't know that my kids get on TikTok. So,
So you're not on TikTok? Is that what you say?
right, right, right. But, we're all conservative in some area. We're all late adopters in some area. But the reality is, but I publicly admit that just now.
Yeah.
But what you have in the translation industry is everyone pretending we're here, we're, exploring agentic, blah, blah, blah. It's like, dude,
Stop exploring.
exploring is good, but also reality, start implementing. And the
Deploying
reality
it.
is, yeah, like workflows are a mess, 6 human steps, no machine translation post editing yet for most of the content. Just vendor has you, and you can't even change anything, right? So that's the
No,
kind of stuff that's going
when
on
when
in people's day to day.
I don't know why would people do that. To be honest with you, put on a news that it is not reality or they're not true. I think everybody's looking for the the hurrah kind of a message out there. I don't know what it is, but that's an old way of saying we're doing well, but we're not doing well. In your opinion, when I talked to you last time, Adam, you mentioned that your market sector or the market segment that you work with is the enterprise, is your customer directly,
Yeah.
and you don't work with, I don't know if that changed since last time we spoke, that much with LSPs or the language industry in general. Is that still the case?
That's very much the case. So it's just a much simpler proposition to, large buyers say, hey, we can automate, provided you are doing post editing, right? Human quality workflows with machine translation post editing at scale, we can help you automate whatever 50 million words this year or whatever, right? It's a very clear value proposition. You automate this much and you keep the same human quality, right? Easier said than done, but very simple if you can prove that it's working. With LSPs, they're always living day to day, worried about cannibalizing the business, et cetera, right? That's just a whole sort of psychological can of worms. They don't necessarily have the incentives. It's like if you tell lawyers, hey, we can help reduce your billable hours, right? They don't want
Yeah,
to reduce their billable hours.
that's right.
So that's
Lawyers
just,
are famous for that.
right. That's just another can of worms that's sort of out of the scope of what we do and not our mission.
Now, if can you, for the audience who are not familiar with ModelFront, just can you explain to us high level how the technology work without getting into the weeds of it? In general, like I know many customers probably will have different content management systems. They work with many LSPs. They have their internal departments. Content is flowing through not one channel. I'm imagining content is flowing in most of your customers through hundreds of channels. If you don't mind, explain where does it fit in the ecosystem, I guess.
Right. So, firstly, they're going to keep all of that, right? That's important. Secondly, they have a TMS. So, it's those hundreds of channels, yes, do all flow through a TMS. And I think it is important. That is like a prerequisite, right? You can't sort of like want automation, et cetera, if your house is not in order. So, you gotta have to have all the content flowing through the TMS, have your machine translation engine or engines connected, et cetera, right? And so you keep all of that. A model front basically auto confirms a bunch of MT segments inside the TMS. So after the TM, so first they get their TM matches, right? It comes in from the CMS, they get their TM matches, the machine translation runs. Now, after that machine translation step, and before the human post editing step, model front is basically like this agent working inside of the TMS and saying, okay, we're going to auto confirm this one, this one, this one. Nope, this one we can't. That's still, we're going to not touch that. So it's still going to go to human, auto confirm, leave, auto confirm, like that. And that's before maybe the project even goes out for quoting, right? So right there in the project, billing, you can already see, hey, now it's, let's say, 50% done. There's another 50% still remaining. And that's going to then go out to the agency or linguists.
So I guess from my perspective, that's called, I think, quality prediction, right? Is that what you call it internally?
Correct, correct. Yes, internally and externally, we wouldn't consider quality estimation alone to be enough. So a score to be enough because,
Because a lot of people are using a scoring mechanism, right? I'm assuming.
a lot of people are trying to use a scoring mechanism. I haven't seen
Okay.
one. I
What's
haven't
the
seen a
inside story
success
there?
a success story
You
yet.
have a success. Yeah. Okay.
I've heard only language that's not, fit to use on this episode with regard to the experiences with those. All right. So the thing is, it might spit out 72, even assuming that 72 kind of makes sense, which it often doesn't in some of these cases. You got to decide, is 72, below the threshold or above the threshold, right? And you have thousands of combinations of content type and language, right? So quality prediction is, hey, at the end of the day, approve or reject.
Now, one of the thing or items that the industry struggles with is that entire conversation around when it comes to quality. Is it good enough, or should I always be reaching out to the ultimate content quality that a human or a machine combined can produce? Is there a line in your application, in your software, in ModelFront, where that is being considered good enough versus top quality, and who controls that? Who's in control? The translator, the project manager, the programmer?
So we don't generally provide control there. Rather, we have to deliver to their bar. And that bar is being set essentially by the human translation, by the whatever bar they're editing to, the human translation is being edited to, and we have to match that.
So that
So
that quality indicator is controlled by the human translator or whoever is on the inside.
I'm sa- I'm saying effectively, right? The quality is whatever it is in the workflow before model front's in the picture. That's
Okay.
what decides where the quality bar is, right?
Oh, I see.
So you can't say, hey,
It's
today
not a
we currently
gauge that
with
you can move in and out kind of thing.
right, right. For all intents and purposes, that's not what they want. So, firstly, it's not possible to say, "Hey, today our quality bar is here, and this is, the training data and the TMs and everything that we have, and I want AI to go here." Like based on what data, how would it match that? It doesn't even know, right? What that means here. So, but what we can do is match that, right? Now, we could also lower it, but nobody wants that. They want to match it.
Now, it's very interesting that you've talked to me a little bit about machine translate foundation that you created alongside with ModelFront, which is interesting pairing because for profit company, profit organizations, for profit organizations such as anybody, I guess anybody is in business. Some people are not, most people are in business not to be philanthropists. They'd like to get some
Mhm.
profit, or that's why you're in business for. But to start a foundation alongside that, what drove you to it? What motivated you to it?
When we first started ModelFront and we started talking to all these large buyers, so much of the time, there were folks who weren't quite ready. They were still just starting to use machine translation to do post editing with, and or they were already started, but they often had a ton of questions like, which machine translation engine is the best? We have Canadian French, not, French, European French, right? Which engine should we use? Which one is right for our scenario? And really, the answer is it depends. So it really depends on, do you have data to customize with or not? How much bandwidth do you have? Which locale? Do you care more? Do you have what kind of content do you have, et cetera, right? If it's DeepL, Google, Microsoft, whatever. And this is not ModelFront's business. We're not, I think this information should be free and open. It's good for the world, and it's less work for me if this is just out on a website. And maybe somebody else has a better answer than I do.
Mm-hmm.
So let's have this
Open it
information
up.
out there, right? And so it's not necessarily a charity. It's also just, right and less work for me because this is not ModelFront's business. We want people to have great machine translation, but there's really no reason in this day and age that should be kind of gatekept, kept by consultants, or that you should have to ask an ex Google Translate engineer to get the right answer on that. That should just be on the web. So, and now the LLMs have totally learned all the content, and so even if you ask ChatGPT or Claude about these questions, they give the right answers. And so our motto was like simple questions, simple answers. Like when we started the Machine Translate Foundation and machinetranslate.org, you just couldn't get an answer to simple things like which machine translation APIs are out there.
True. Now, the quality estimation, like I've been around the industry for a while, and there's a lot of people been dabbling with this thing for many years. Quality estimation and the search topic since, and it's been researched for at least since 2013.
Yep.
And there was many workshops around statistical machine translation. I guess that's what
hmm
started it all.
You know too much.
A little bit. So, what changed that allowed you to turn the research concept into something that actually works in production environment? And why did it take so long, do you think, in general, to get there?
So, firstly, definitely deep learning, and then these transformer-based models, which happen to come out of my old team at Google, right? The T and GPT, right? Sort of started in those circles. So if you go back to 2013, 2014, the models were using a very, much older approach. The first work of Dr. Lucia Specia was using what's called feature engineering, so sort of an older type of machine learning that wasn't super scalable. So that's the one thing. The next thing I would say is that the market grew a lot, right? So if you sort of extrapolate back, how many people, the overall translation market was smaller, and then the number of people doing post editing was much smaller 10, 15 years ago, right? So there just wasn't as much demand for AI to check and fix AI because people weren't using AI in most of these organizations. And then the third thing I would say is very specific to ModelFront. It's just this thing is actually really, really hard, right? Technology got better, market got bigger, but this whole thing is really, really hard to pull off. You know, with all respect to my old colleagues at Google, they launched something, after we launched, right? They kind of launched something similar and tried and failed. Yeah, that's most of the large translation buyers have tried, most of the large LSPs have tried, all the TMSs have tried, and they've all failed, right? I mean, in the sense of I don't see any success stories out there. So this thing is very, very hard. And so there was just a lot of things, frankly, if I had known how hard it was going to be and how long it would take to sort of get things off the ground, and I probably wouldn't have started it, right? So in essence, there are a lot of things that come together. And the way I like to put it is there's no silver bullet, right? So I compare it more to something like Waymo, right? There's not like a trick, right? It's just hard engineering, operations, machine learning, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Now, I think you've introduced an automatic post editing alongside quality prediction, right? Can you walk us through how these two technologies are working together and what does a typical workflow would look like in an automatic post editing? And if you don't mind, maybe for the audience who are listening to this, oh yeah, that's interesting. So how much percentage wise a human are still involved in the process? I'm assuming they're still involved somewhat, but how much?
Right, right. Definitely they are. Humans will always be involved, and we can talk about that too. So if you look at it, right, when we initially started, we were only, basically providing AI to check AI, right, and then triggering human intervention. And based on the fact that, hey, these segments would not be edited anyway. But then the buyer said, well, look, of the stuff that is still getting edited, you're saying it's going to get edited, correctly predicting that it's going to humans. And they're making these very mechanical edits again and again. For example, changing this apostrophe to this apostrophe. The French love to do that, right? But that's a perfect candidate for automation. If your model knows that if your system knows that this is going to get edited, can't you just do that edit for us and then recheck the segment? And if it's good to go, approve that one too. And so, for a long time we said, well, you guys retrain your MT engine and then, there'll be more to approve. But the realities of enterprise translation teams is that never happens. And so we had to provide those models. I can get into why I think it's actually very hard to do that. But so ultimately we ended up having to provide that. And now that's just default available as part of the system, and they don't even have to think about it.
And what do you think the percentage in terms of human involvement right now? 80-20 almost, or where are we at?
It very much varies by content type. So there are cases where it's 80-20, meaning 80% automated and
What I
20%
meant,
still
yeah.
goes to humans. But that is not the majority. There are cases where it's quite the other way around.
Like 2080.
Yeah, 20-80, right? So 80% goes to humans and 20% is automated. And that can be for a ton of factors, right? So sort of how novel it is, or even things like segmentation and so on, obviously language pair. So it's a real range.
So before I move into the AI impact on the human, and we'll talk about that in a second, but I have a general question to ask you, like because you work on the enterprise side. I think the most obvious question it comes to mind in from a business perspective. What are you seeing out there, Adam, in terms of these language services that are embedded inside of those large organizations? There was a wave of outsourcing all these people. Are they back inside now? Is there like a reverse wave? What are you, or are you seeing more automation that is probably don't need to be staffed anymore? To be honest with you, with a bit of an automation.
Yeah, so I sort of see that I haven't been in that industry enough, right, in the translation industry enough to sort of have seen all the cycles. But to me, it feels a little bit like these sort of server side versus client side
Yeah,
waves that you have in computing, right, where that kind of goes one direction, then comes back the other direction.
central, decentral.
Right, right. But overall, there's a lot to be said for keeping control in house, but like outsourcing sort of auto scalable things to agencies. Right. So we're pretty agnostic there, I should say, except that we do strongly believe that you get the best outcomes when key things are controlled in house. Right. So, but it really depends on the scale of the organization too, and what makes sense. So I don't want to prescribe anything for anybody, but certainly the buyers we work with keep the key things in house and are have been very the reason they were in a position, right, they're essentially ahead of the pack. The reason they were in a position to talk to us and implement this is because they had kept control of their workflows, even sort of with the previous generation of technology, or were able to get back control of their
Yeah, because I've
workflows,
seen
of
it.
their data, of their tools.
Yeah, I've seen the flow from being centralized internally. You got a bank with I don't know 150 translators internally to deciding in the early 2000s to outsource all this to an LSP who they thought by then saving cost on headcounts internally will help them financially. And then that happened. And then the question of efficiency came out because, the world works in 5-year contract cycle. So they contracted with the LSPs for 5 years. At the end of the 5 years, said, okay, we gave it to you. You worked with us. Thank you very much. Now we got to look for efficiencies. So the LSP starts to squeeze the ways they produce things, and they could not achieve the balance, in my opinion, my personal humble opinion. They could not achieve the balance between squeezing cost down versus keep the quality steady. And then what you end up with, customers unhappy, and then they started getting more control internally to control the LSPs. And then they found out single LSP is no good. We can't put all the eggs in one basket. We have to diversify our LSP demographic, if you will. And then they end up with from one LSP to 20. And then that mushroom group of LSPs, it grew, it mushroomed out. And then you end up now, you need management tools, you need software to handle this, and you probably need to hire a little bit more staff internally. I think back to your earlier comment, the cycle is being reversed internally, I think, but in a different way now. Probably people are not hiring as many translators internally as they did before, but now they're more control internal.
Right, right. I mean, if you think about it, the actually finding the right translator at the end of the supply chain is a very hard thing. And that's kind of where the LSP adds value, right? Because, who knows, let's say biotech, patent law, and Vietnamese, and is not working as a patent lawyer, let's say, right? They're working as a translator, right? And they're available right now. Right? This is extremely niche stuff. It's actually very hard to find these people, and they're not commoditized, right? So that's, to me, kind of the value of the LSP. And then if, as a buyer, you don't necessarily have like a full-time need for somebody with this amazing set of skills, right? And there are many multiple companies that do have that need, so it kind of makes sense to aggregate that for that person. So that's sort of the argument for not having the linguists in house necessarily, right? There are exceptions, gaming companies, et cetera, but like there's a lot of reason not to do that. And so sort of, the question, but if you let like the management of the overall operation get outsourced, well, they're never going to add efficiencies because they don't want efficiencies, right? Et cetera, et cetera. So like from my perspective, just looking at the technology side, very clear thing is like, obviously never let the agency be the one who sort of controls your TMs, right? Like this is just, sort of old-fashioned street smarts, right?
Well, there are some agencies that won't give you the TM, or you have
Right,
to.
right. This kind of stuff, right? You should also be the one who chooses which MT engine you use, and whether you use MT or not, right? That should be on your side as a buyer. Right? These are just don't get the TMS from the agency, and especially not the TMS developed by the agency, right? Because they're never going to add the features that add efficiency, et cetera, et cetera. So those are kind of some basic rules of thumb, right? I think just sort of basic things that are not controversial, that there's no like sort of trade-off there. Like you definitely should keep those things on your side as a buyer of any
Yeah.
serious scale.
And like just again another general view probably from your side, Adam, if you don't mind just commenting on this. We work in an industry that is more of a transformation industry, right? We take a content from one language, we transform it into another language. But with the advancement of technology nowadays, I mean, that must be on its way out, I would say. I mean, why would people translate if they can create content in the target language right away?
I'll take the other side here.
Okay.
To some degree, that's all it's always been happening, right? And if you can do that, you definitely should, right? And so, one example, you see, I don't know, some articles about the stock market, right? They're kind of generated based on the price action, or you have e-com scenarios where it's generated based on the characteristics of the item. But I think a lot of the high value stuff, people complain they're downstream. And it's like, yeah, that's why you get paid the big bucks. So life's just like that. I have this patent that I need translated now. I don't have something, the luxury to generate things. This is what's sitting on my desk right now that I need to go to 20 languages. We're the DoD or the DOW, I guess now, and we've intercepted, a million SMS of terrorist chatter or whatever, right? And we need this translated right now. I can't like generate the terrorist chatter in a
True,
bunch of
yeah.
languages, right? So
There are some industries and contents that I guess there will always be translation, but in
right,
general, if you're talking about marketing, if you're talking about like the other side of, or the enterprise side, Do you think this will take hold or take a foot inside of?
I think people should always try, but I think that essentially that it already has been happening to some degree, and the industry as we see it is already sort of the industry after you do everything you can do with machine translation, after you do everything you can do with content generation, and really what we're left with right now, right, which is to be clear, this growing, $75 billion industry is the stuff that really it's so slow and painful right now that the only reason anybody would ever put anything through human translation is because they have to, because it's that important to deal with this painful process and painful industry.
Yeah. Now, one of the, you mentioned that before, that one of your essentials, I guess, in your technology in ModelFront is you work at a segment level, which is mirrors how translation memories and CAT tools already work. Was that intentional, Adam? And building this kind of a model, where do you see it? How do you see it revolutionizing everything?
Very intentional. So we get asked all the time, hey, can you do it at the word level? Hey, can you do the document level, right? Et cetera, et cetera. But really the economic unit
Segment.
is the segment, right? And if you think about it, I think there's a clear cognitive basis for that, right? That was already established with the translation memory since the 80s. But if I give you a sentence and I tell you which word is in the sentence is wrong, let's say, or not, we're not sure about, you still have to load the whole sentence in your brain to check
Oh
that
yeah.
one word. You
Where
can't
does it
just like
fit?
check that word in isolation, right? So there's no point going further than that, right? And at that point, you're also biasing the people in terms of where they look, where they edit, et cetera. So you're contaminating your feedback data, um, right? So there's not much. If they have to look at it, they have to look at it, right? Doesn't matter how much highlighting you do or whatever. And then document level, it's the opposite. It's like, all right, I approved or rejected this whole document. Well, that's not very useful if there was one sentence here that needed to be looked at, but I flag the whole document for human review. That's a big waste, right? So yeah, segment level is
I mean, level is
is what's
intentional
proven
with
to
that
work.
mirrors.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. Which I see the benefit of it. I mean, the entire, excuse me, from the point of changing a word inside of a sentence is pretty difficult if you don't put the entire sentence in context of what you're trying to
right,
say.
right,
The word could apply, could not apply. I can't tell you.
right,
You got
right,
to tell
right.
me what does it mean
And
and where does it fit.
you can make the argument that you need some context across segments, across sentences, right? But it's much, much less. It is, if we're honest, right? There are examples, but like 90% of sentences you can look at without seeing anything else and say it's basically right or basically wrong.
So let me ask you this now: your customers, what are they seeing in terms of improvement or in terms of efficiency gains? X, 5x. Where? How do you measure that? Like, what's your claim?
It is very much that 80/20 to 20/80 range, right? So for some folks, it may only be 20% of stuff gets
Yeah,
automated,
yeah.
but that may be a great outcome for them financially. Um, and in other cases, it's 80%. So yeah, 5x.
And if somebody's interested to say, "Hey, I want to check out ModelFront. I want to see if I can work with them," is there any prerequisite?
There are a ton of prerequisites. You can read about the basic ones at modelfront.com/quality prediction. I think, yeah, first one would basically be that do you actually do high volume, high quality machine translation post editing, right? Um, Second one, do you have like a real need for efficiency here, right? If you're just trying to check the AI box, there's a ton of booths at every translation conference of people who will sell you BS so you can check the AI box for another quarter. So those are some of the prerequisites that
And I have to ask you this whole buzzwords thing. I know it's not your favorite, but I gotta ask you. I'd love to see your reaction on this one. There's a lot of buzz around large language models. I don't need to name them here. And so, what do you think of that? The large language model. How do they compare to traditional neural machine translation engines? And what are you seeing in terms of perhaps from a conversion perspective? Are they fundamentally different tools, or are they pretty much the same?
I would say, I guess fundamentally, literally fundamentally, the fundament is the same, but I think in practical terms, it's quite different, right? Because now something like RAG, something like, okay, go check the internet and research this thing, right? This is, we use these agents all the time, sort of internally for operating
I
model
was going to
front.
ask you that.
And
You use it internally
yeah,
for,
I mean,
yeah,
yeah,
okay.
Yeah, yeah, and that's fundamentally different, right? So we are aggressively using this ourselves, right? When we started ModelFront, it was sort of like some of translators' jobs are getting automated. Now it's like software engineers' jobs are getting automated, including even like machine learning, training machine learning, right? So it's very much, and we've totally embraced that. Yeah. So it is qualitatively different at the scale and accuracy that's been reached right now.
So let's take a look at, down the road. What is the future? What do you think your prediction would be for 2020, end of 2026? I can't look further than that, I guess. 2026, maybe 2027 if you want to throw that.
Fortunately, I don't think things will change fast enough in the translation industry, if I'm really honest, right? So I do think we're going to see a lot of shakeouts. Like there's just a lot of stuff that was kind of fake or was, noise or whatever, that it wasn't sustainable and it's going to kind of like fall apart. It was probably already writing was on the wall end of 2025, and in 2026 it's not going to be able to be hidden anymore. So I do think we're going to kind of see some of that, right? Some of these 5-year contracts come due and things have to renew, right? That kind of stuff. I think, what I don't like to predict the future too much, but I can see what's already happening. Firstly, a lot of teams sort of laying off people, then hiring other people, or
Yeah,
sometimes the
I
same
saw that. Yeah.
people. It's very funny.
Firing them very quickly, I guess, before they even know that do they need to hire them back, or is it true to fire them? Like nobody's validating that. They're saying, okay, well, it's on the spreadsheet. I have to fire.
Right. So that kind of chaos. Then but I think overall there's still a need for people. It just may be different people or on different terms or whatever, right? So I'm not worried about that. I think things will grow. I think there's no shortage of content to be translated. There's no shortage, I think people got to get out of Silicon Valley sometimes. Like the growth of the internet is still ongoing, and the people who are coming online now who don't understand English, right? Just to be blunt, they were very poor and they're getting richer much faster and having more kids much faster than the people who were already online and spoke English, right? So from that sense, like the need is greater than ever, and it's going to increase, right? So, but I think that really, 2026 is really the year where you better start machine translation, post editing, getting free of your vendors, et cetera, et cetera. But I would have said that in 2025 and 2024 too, right? So and I'm just surprised how long people can muddle along doing things,
Do you think
business
it's
as usual.
just a procurement bureaucracy, or do you think people like they know what they want but they can't get it right now because they're stuck in a contract?
It's a mix. I think every scenario
Mixed
is
bag.
different, right? Some people inherited a bad scenario that they couldn't get out of and they know that it's wrong. Some people, it's literally their comfort zone. They are maybe closer to the vendor than they are to, their own company. And they'd like literally rather get fired than have to learn something new. And sometimes you literally see
Sure.
that, right? So you got the full spectrum of things. And maybe every industry is like this. I just know the translation industry.
And you know what? There are a lot of people out there, for instance, that they are holding on to what they know. And you're right, you build a comfort zone and nothing has to change. And they don't need to change, right? And generally, change is forced upon us as an industry from outside the industry, not from within the industry, either by market requirements or customer requirements, or the customers asking for various things. But the industry generally is like, we draw a box, we want to make sure that everybody fits within that box, and if they don't fit within the box, it's got to be, we change, no big deal, but it's going to be like, you started the conversation by talking about emotional attachment to the workflow that we currently have, emotional attachment to the process that we currently have, or the technology that we use. But meanwhile, we live in a world where that is not affordable anymore. Nobody can afford legacy systems and analog ways of doing things. And moving to the new realm of doing things and processing things, either this or I'm seeing a lot of companies being sold. I'm seeing a lot of companies being acquired by other companies because people are, put a question mark. Should I continue down the road? Most of these companies, 19,000 companies in the industry, right? You got to remember that. Most of these companies are started by a translator, not necessarily a business entrepreneur that thought, I see a business opportunity, I'm going to go build something. But most of these companies are started by freelancers and they grew from there. And now they're faced with the reality of things. Things are changing rapidly.
Right. I think that's actually a very interesting point, right? Is that the barrier to providing translation, especially if it's, we're not talking certified or some niche technical domain or whatever, the
Mm,
barrier is very, very low, right? And so it's extremely competitive as sort of a provider. And I would even go far as to say that most of the pain or like the existential angst of the language service providers of the agencies is precisely due to that and has nothing to do with AI, right? So, it used to be that just there weren't that many people online or sort of like accessible that, let's say, an American company could connect with who spoke Russian, let's say. And now you just have, tens of millions of them online, and they compete with the ones who, were already in America or whatever, right? And they're all around the world, tens of millions of people in Africa who speak great French, right? So that is really what drives a lot of the sort of existential angst and race to the bottom is competing with other humans, because the demand has been growing. The number of words bought has just grown and grown every year, right? And it's easy to sort of blame it on AI, but
mm,
in essence, it's they say you are other people's traffic, right? It's like you are other people's you know
true.
competitor translation agency that's undercutting them on price.
That's right. Now, before we wrap up, if you don't mind, Adam, where can people learn more about ModelFront, about machine translation in general? And I know you have the Machine Translate Foundation resources as well. So where can we find out a bit more information about these two?
ModelFront, it's on modelfront.com. And yeah, about machine translation in general, machinetranslate.org is a great way to find out sort of evergreen questions. Which translation APIs exist? Which ones, support Swahili? Those kind of questions. Key concepts explained simply. If you have more involved questions, like, which one is the best for my scenario, right? There's an open forum, is reddit.com/r/machine translation. Or if you just write the machine translation subreddit in Google, you'll find that. And there, it's a great place to ask questions, and then you'll get a range of answers from smart folks to your specialized question.
Any final thoughts or advice to our listeners?
Yeah, definitely independence and control, right? So those kind of things are not going away. If you want innovation, you have to be in control. No one else is gonna, make things more efficient for you if they're in control.
And I want to thank you, Adam, for joining me today. Appreciate it.
Likewise, Robin. Always good to talk to you.
Always good to talk to you as well. And for the listeners, thank you so much for listening in. If you're coming on YouTube, thanks for watching us. If you're coming on our podcast channels, thanks for listening in. And great news, since November till now, we just passed 100,000 downloads. I really appreciate all your support. Thank you so much for being part of this channel. And I really appreciate it. And I'll see you guys at the next episode. Adam, thanks so much again. And I wish you all the best in your endeavors.